Hello and welcome to another exciting presentation. Today's presentation is going to be on demystifying Azure Firewall. And as many of you who have been following me and have been watching my video series, this is the latest one that we'll discuss and try to understand what Azure Firewall offerings are, and hopefully it will help you make a decision when you start looking into Azure Firewall versus other network virtual appliances such as Palo Alto. I would give you my perspective, and I hope that would help you to make a important decision in your infrastructure. As choosing a firewall is a very important activity, especially changing a firewall is not an easy task. So making the right decision by choosing the right firewall, I think, is extremely important. And I hope that this presentation would help you make that decision better. With that, this is going to be a pretty long video because I have to touch a number of topics as well as I have to do a demo. So I have divided this demo into two parts. Part one, where we will discuss the different elements, different feature sets, known issues, and other stuff. And then in part two, we will dive into a demo, which would be a very interesting demo that it would touch almost most of the types of the use cases that you might encounter when you actually start deploying Azure Firewall in your environment. With that, let's just look into what the agenda looks like for this presentation. And very high level, uh, we'll just have an introduction what Azure Firewalls are. We talk about features, which was basic versus standard versus premium and preview, looking into pricing, looking into some of the limitations of Azure Firewall. Also, we will discuss some of the known issues, performance related issues with the Azure Firewall. And then very interestingly, as I promised, I will give you my perspective of comparison between these two firewalls, Azure Firewall versus Palo Alto, which is one of the most advanced next-gen firewall. And then we'll briefly touch Azure Firewall concepts, and then we'll go into the actual demo. And demo is going to be very interesting. We'll go for the deployment. We'll go into the firewall policies, different rule collection groups, rule collections, rules, threat intelligence, IDPS, TLS inspection, both inbound and outbound. This is going to be interesting, right? Inbound and outbound TLS inspection. How can we do that? Web categories, policy analytics, and we will see how the VPN can connect passing through the firewall. We'll see north-south traffic when we will hit a internal website from public. We will also see how do we use internet egress, and also, as I said, TLS inspection, both outbound and inbound. And then we'll quickly dive into traffic monitoring, which would also include policy analytics. So this is going to be very interesting. As you guys see, a lot of materials to cover, so I'll quickly move into. And moving forward, what is an Azure Firewall, right? So Azure Firewall, primarily, as all of you know, is a PaaS service, is a managed Azure Cloud Native Firewall. If you start working on premium SKU or premium firewall, then I would consider it almost as a next-gen firewall. It's a stateful firewall, and it provides several features that may excite you and may make a little bit more easier for your decision-making process, as it provides you auto scalability. It provides you a built-in highly available firewalls. It is intelligent. It is one of the quickest and simplest way of deploying a firewall in my viewpoint. And very importantly, it is user-friendly and intuitive, because when you start looking into Azure Firewall, you really don't need high-skilled Palo Alto skill set or something like that, right? As long as you are familiar with the networking, Azure networking, anyone can deploy, can manage, can operate these firewalls seamlessly. And that's very important from operations and maintenance perspective. You would see what it means. And under the hood, basically what Microsoft does is that depending on which SKU you choose, it would deploy a VM skill sets, which is load balanced by a load balancer. This is very straightforward, and because it is using a skill set that it builds the high availability, It provides you the scalability, auto scale out automatically based on 60% CPU utilization or more. It would provision additional VMs in the VM scale set. And the best part is that when you look into, and I'll go a little deeper into the next chapters, you only pay for the service. You don't pay for the VM cost or licensing per VM or per vCPU that maybe you may be seeing when we start comparing other firewalls here. So very interesting, very straightforward, very simple, quickest way to deploy, very easy to actually use it as well, right? So it's not very complex, it's very straightforward. And you will see once I get into the demo that how simple, how quick, how fast, how easy it can be. By the way, as a consumer or as a user, you will never see these VM skill sets or load balancer. This is internal to Microsoft. And if you try to see it, you are never going to see that. I just want to make sure I mention this is all hidden. This is the architecture behind the scene, which as a consumer or as a user, we don't have any access to. Moving forward, right, before you make these important decisions, you also need to understand different firewall SKUs. So we have a firewall standard, which I as mentioned, it provides the layer 3 to layer 7 connectivity policies. It has got Microsoft threat protection for non-malicious IPs. Then it can also use other features, right? So I'm not going to go into this picture here, but you see here built-in high availability. Availability zones is also equally important. That adds feathers to the high availability solution that you have in firewall, which in my viewpoint is sometimes not possible with other network virtual appliances. Okay, and then as I said earlier, unrestricted cloud scalability, application FQDN filtering rules, you have network traffic filtering rules, and maybe if you have not used Azure Firewall in past, so it might confuse you what these are. Don't get worried about it. We'll go in more details about what this application rules are, what the network rules are, what the DNet rules are, what the FQDN tags are, what the service tags are, threat intelligence. When you say only alert or deny that options, right? DNS proxy. I will try to touch as much as possible in our live demo. And then on top of it, you can use in a force tunnel mode. You can have the SNAT support, source net address translation. Obviously, destination address translation is also obviously absolutely a requirement for the firewall. Where you have Azure monitor logging, force tunneling, web categories, and certifications, right? So this is a standard firewall. When you move into the premium firewall, which will give you some additional feature that brings it closer to the next gen firewall, which is called a TLS inspection. Just to make sure, when I talk about TLS inspection, Azure Firewall only provides you a outbound TLS inspection. For inbound TLS inspection, we still need to do something beyond that, beyond Azure Firewall, and most likely we'll use an application gateway to make sure that we can decrypt and encrypt back, and you can put an application gateway in front of Azure Firewall, and it still is a doable solution, right? IDPS, which is an additional feature that has been added into the premium version of Azure Firewall. URL filtering, we'll see what URL is and what web categories, what is the URL and FQDN difference. Sometimes it could be confusing when we talk about these terminologies, URL versus FQDN. And once we get into the lab, then I would be able to demonstrate and show you what the differences are. And then basic firewall is also in the preview mode, which is a very simplistic way. It does not have all the bells and whistles here. The features are limited, as the name suggests. It will provide you network and application traffic filtering, threat intelligence based on the malicious traffic, built-in high availability, which is of course part of the Azure Firewall architecture, and it will seamlessly integrate with other Azure services, right? So that's very high level. Moving on, the pricing part is very interesting, because when you would compare it with some of the other third-party NVAs, such as Palo Alto, you will find it very attractive, for the lack of better words, right? So if you see, the price is very reasonable. right? I don't have to read it for you. You know what it is. But as depending on which SKU you are using, right, you would probably use Azure Firewall policy. Keep in mind that if you are using a standard, you could use the conventional firewall rules. But if you happen to go to the premium route, then you have to use Azure Firewall policy. You don't have the option of legacy firewall rules that you can use with the standard or basics, right? So, and the depending on firewall policy pricing, $100 per policy per region. But there is a caveat here. If you read here, no other firewall manager policy charges will be done for policies that are associated to a single firewall. So if you have one policy attached to one regional firewall, then you don't pay this price as well, right? So, but if you try to attach this firewall policy with multiple firewalls, multiple regions, as has been demonstrated in the diagram here, then you would end up paying um, 1,200 per policy per region, and it gives you a good explanation. Feel free to read it. I'm not going to waste your time into this because, as I said, a lot to cover. Now, Azure Firewall limits, it's important to understand what the limits are because these are the key factors that I think everybody should consider before you make a decision to use Azure Firewall in your environment. So maximum data throughput is 100 Gbps for premium firewalls, 30 Gbps for standard, and 250 Mbps for basic, which is in the preview mode, right? And that's given. So depending on what your workload is, it would be an important factor to consider here. The rule limits are 20,000 unique source and destination in network rules, which is self-explanatory here. Total size of the rules in a single rule collection group, and as I said, you will understand once you get into the demo that what this rule collection group means and what are the number of rule collection groups. So this is a good insight. Maximum destination network address translation rules are 250 maximum unique destinations, public IPs, ports, and protocols, right? And then we have the minimum Azure firewall subnet size. This is important because /26, that means it allows you with /26 maximum, I think if I calculate, about 60 VMs to be deployed in one skill set. And that is where the scalability comes into picture. If you choose a smaller subnet here, then you would probably compromise with the scalability here, which probably you don't want to do. So make sure that you do /26 or higher. I would go with /26 in my viewpoint. The port range is 1 to 65,535. There are certain known limitations with this, so please make sure that you read the limitations part and the performance section in my presentation and the known issues. The public IP addresses, all these public IP addresses are attached to the Azure Load Balancer that I showed you before, which is under the hood. You will never see that, and you will see about 250 maximum of public IP addresses could be used, right? Now, this would be important when you are talking about ingress traffic, that's your limit, right? So in a region, if you have more than 250 inbound ingress point, then you might either have to consider multiple Azure firewalls to distribute the workload or think about alternate solutions, right? IP address and IP groups, maximum 200 IP groups per firewall and maximum 5,000 individual IP addresses per each IP group, right? That's very clear. Route table, Azure Firewall subnet where we deploy the Azure Firewall has a 0.0.0.route with the next hop type value set to internet. You should not be messing with it up unless it would mess up your whole deployment. So we should not touch it. And the TLS inspection timeout is 120 seconds, right? So straightforward. I would probably try to keep this deck into the description so you have this information handy and you don't have to wait on presentation to go through. Now, from the performance perspective, as always, it is highly recommended to run a performance test outside your production. This is important to see that how does your firewall would perform in your given workload. Needless to say that you should try to emulate your network topology as well as you should consider traffic growth pattern, right? This particular slide gives you what is the bandwidth here, performance data, right? Standard is 30 Gbps. As I mentioned earlier, with premium, with TLS and IDS is 100 Gbps, and with premium with only IPS, right? So IPS intrusion system only takes place when you will see in the lab that when we configure the signatures on the IDPS tab, right? Unless you do that, or alert and deny mode. If you keep it only alert, then it will not kick in. So this is important. Throughput for the single connection, that is also given in this slide here, right? So if firewall use case throughput Gbps is standard is up to 1.5 gigabits per second, premium is up to 9 gigabits per second, and TCP connection with IDPS is up to 300 Mbps with alert and deny mode. So these are important considerations in my viewpoint when you're making a decision to use Azure Firewall for your workload, because this could come in your way if you have a workload that needs more throughput than what is being presented here, right? Similarly, initial firewall deployment also, I've given you some statistics here, so you can leverage it for your decision-making process. Moving forward, this is very important in my viewpoint, right? This is where you may not realize it, and once you deploy it, it may hunt you back. So my suggestion would be, and I don't want to read all the details here because it's quite a lot that you need to know what are the known issues with the standard firewall as well as with the premium firewalls, right? So some of them could be a showstopper for you and maybe not. And unless you go through these exceptions or these known issues, you should not make a decision to go to Azure Firewall or not. And that's my personal view. You may disagree with me, but this is very important because rather to avoid any surprises and shocks after you have put your production workload on Azure Firewalls, is better to be a little bit preemptive here and plan it properly, look into these known issues and see if any of these issues are going to be a potential showstopper for your deployment. I can't say anything better than that. I have given you a whole laundry list of these issues here. You keep going on, and because each item, if I start discussing, would take sufficient amount of time for explanation and going in details, right? So I probably, in the interest of time, I don't want to do that. If you have any questions, you can put it into chat or ask the questions after you watch this presentation. Again, this is all standard known issues, right? You see how many of them, and make sure that you have a very good understanding, or otherwise you can call Microsoft to get a better clarification if you have questions that is really concerning to your deployment. So these are all firewall standard known issues. Then we need to go and I'll present you the premium firewall issues, which is in addition to what you have seen in the standard firewall issues, right? So this is important, right? And I hope this data set that I'm presenting you, again, to my initial point, would help you make a educated decision for choosing the right firewall for your environment. Now, as I promised, this is I will try to give you my perspective. You may agree or disagree. And before I go into this side of the presentation, I just want to make sure that I let you know that I'm not in no way a Palo Alto SME. So I would try the best with whatever I know with my deployment with a couple of customers. But feel free to challenge me or feel free to correct it, right? So as per the Gartner, the rating is pretty close, 4.4 versus 4.6. Now, the important thing that we all know, right, this is Azure Firewall is a very cost-effective, easy to implement solution, but as far as the feature sets are concerned, they are limited in as compared to Palo Alto. There is no denial about it. Even Microsoft would agree to what I'm saying here, because obviously Palo Alto is a next-gen, very robust firewall with amazing feature set, I can't sugarcoat it, right? This is what it is, right? So that is true. At the same time, right, we need to understand that these are extremely robust but are very complicated. This complicated part is the one that should be concerning to decision makers when you start working on Palo Alto. Imagine that when you deploy these kind of a complex technology, you need specialized people, specialized skills to deal with it. It's not an every Tom and Harry's role to work on Palo Alto, right? Because as I said, and the more you go into, more you work into, you realize that you need um, real good skills for Palo Alto to be successful with your firewall deployment. I'm being very honest here, guys. Now, not only this, there's one more color to it, which I would like to add from my personal experience. You may find very good Palo Alto resources that are expert on Palo Alto, but when you deploy Palo Alto in cloud, especially in Azure, it becomes a different animal, right? That it has got its own nuances and challenges, and not every Palo Alto engineer that you will come across has or have an experience to deliver the Palo Alto in Azure. That is always a challenge, right? So keep in mind that's a lesser known commodity, if I have to say that, right? You may not find a lot many resources that are trained or that have experience of deploying Palo Alto in Azure, right? So it may be an excellent resource for Palo Alto if you deploy it on-prem, but the same resource may struggle when you deploy it in cloud, especially in Azure. We are talking in terms of Azure here, right? So that's very important. This is my perception. I have learned it hard way. I have worked with for quite some time in this area with the several resources, and I think I'm stating truth and I'm being honest when I say that. Moving forward, this is again a comparison between Azure Firewall and Palo Alto. This is a little bit more technical than you would see an average comparison on if you start searching on blog or somewhere. So when we talk about different parameters here, you will see who scores it. I'll leave it to make the decision yourself. I would present the facts and you can agree or disagree with me. When I say about Azure Firewall, ease of deployment is extremely easy. It's as quick, as simple as possible, and you could do it multiple ways. You can do it in a GUI, you can do a CLI, PowerShell, you can use Terraform, whatever you want to use it. ARM templates, right? So it is very, very quick, very easy, very simple deployment. Requirements are also very minimalistic, right? You don't need a whole lot. As long as you have a VNet, you have your subnet created, in the same resource group where you are creating the firewall. That's all you need to do, right? And as long as you understand that basic requirement, it's it's a straightforward thing, right? It's quick as it gets deployed very fast. You can deploy it, test it, try it, and then destroy it if you like. But this would, in my viewpoint, I have seen Palo Alto deployments multiple times. Compared to when you go into the other side and you talk about Palo Alto, extremely complex deployment, right? Especially this is an IaaS deployment, and you consider that when you go to the Azure firewall, this is a PaaS deployment, right? It's a monumental difference when you look into these two technologies, right? There you go and you click it one time and you're good to go. You have your high availability built in, you have scalability built in, your firewall is good to go. I would say probably within 10-15 minutes, right? Maximum. You're good to go. You start putting your rules there. But when you start going to the other side, it's not that easy, right? And right from the licensing support, which is for flex licensing as far as Palo Alto is concerned, which is based on your vCPUs. You need to figure it out what your supported VM SKUs are, 3 NICs on each, right? Then you need to think about high availability of active-active or active-passive. Both of them has their, pluses or advantages and disadvantages, right? We'll discuss it later here, hopefully. Now you need to also make sure now you are looking into like how do we authenticate to this Palo Alto. So now you need to worry about the SAML authentication, service principal, right? So that they can make the Graph API call and fail over the firewalls and blah, blah, blah. NSGs on each NIC that you need to manage and maintain. If you need to integrate Palo Alto, for an example, Sentinel or Log Analytic Workspace as your centralized monitoring solution or SIEM solution, now you need to think about putting a syslog server, configuring the syslog, fine tuning it so that your logs can present correctly into Sentinel, right? Now, for centralized management, now you need to start looking into Panorama, right? So this is complicated. And when you start looking into the SAML authentication, when you work with Palo, that SAML authentication, unfortunately, Palo would not provide you a read-only SAML account, right? So that means now you need to go back and configure somehow local accounts on Palo. Similar limitation for CLI, you cannot use SAML authentication for CLI, right? And then obviously, as I said, you really need a Palo engineer who has experience to deploy it in Azure. Without that, that deployment is, I would say, impossible, right? If you try to do it yourself, you may run into issues unless you have done it in past, or you need somebody who has real good Palo skills and those Palo skills in Azure, right? Can't be more specific about it. I'm not undermining anything. Palo Alto is a great firewall, no doubt about it. But it is the complexity that you need to keep in mind, because not only you need to deploy it, keep in mind that you also need to manage and operate on those firewalls, right? So then you also start thinking about your resources, your skill set in your organization. All is a relative question. So going back in that reference to the next point, which is the user-friendly in operations, right? As I mentioned earlier, this is highly intuitive as far as the Azure firewalls are concerned and very user-friendly. It is, maybe I'm simplifying it too much, but when you look at yourself in a demo, you will figure it out that it is, I mean, compared to what you need to do in Palo and what you need to do in Azure there's no comparison. This is so simple. It is so simple that as long as you have a relatively good network standing, you could manage it very effectively. First part is that because of the past services, you don't have to worry about a high availability. You don't have to worry about scalability. You don't worry about upgrading, right? All this is being taken care by Azure. So you have offloaded your headache and responsibilities to someone else. What else you want from a cloud perspective? That's the that's the actual goal of a cloud, to use the cloud, to leverage the cloud, and that's exactly what you get when you start using Azure Firewall. On the other hand, if you go to the Palo Alto side, that becomes very complex because now it's an infrastructure as a service. You are responsible for managing, operating, managing high availability, maintenance, right? So from this perspective, it is complex. You need, as I said, you need a Palo engineer who can handle it. Upgrading, scaling up is the only option. And when you scale up a SKU, it needs a reboot, right? And when if you're, let's say hypothetically, you're running in an active passive scenario. Now, when in active passive scenario, you want to upgrade your firewall, well, you will probably upgrade the passive one, but it will need a reboot. Same is the case with active. It will need a reboot. So you need to be careful about it, right? How you do that. So that these are, and then maintaining on a day-to-day basis, right? Creating a new firewall rules, whether it's a DNet rule or it's a spoke-to-spoke connectivity, north-south or east-west traffic or application traffic, is you really need someone who understands that, right? From Palo perspective. On the other hand, it's as simple as that, and you will see it. Seeing is believing once you get into my demo, that how simple it is, right? And that is, I think that's a winner in my viewpoint for Azure Firewall. Both ease of deployment and the user-friendly operations, because it's not that you deploy a firewall one time, right? It is a constant work that you need to do as an organization on this firewall, whether to maintain those firewalls or whether the operational activities, new rules, new regulation, whatever it is, right? So that's where I would say that very carefully you evaluate these two firewalls. And in my personal view, as far as these two factors are concerned, Azure is definitely a winner here between these two. Coming to the cost part, which is equally important, right, if not more. When you look into these solutions, it could be very expensive when you go into the Palo Alto route. On the other hand, Azure firewalls, as I have already given you the cost earlier, I think if I calculate the premium, it's probably going to be about $1,200 a month, irrespective of number of VMs that Microsoft is using in the background. On the contrary, where you go to the Palo Alto, it's very expensive, and your pricing is per vCPU, and then on top of it, they will be charging you for every single VM, because each VM would use own vCPUs, and depending on what throughput you need, and there is a lot of calculations behind it, your Palo Alto solution, obviously 100%, it will be way more expensive than Azure Firewall. Leave aside the data. I don't know about how much data you are going to be transmitting, but that is another factor that when you consider your deployment. And as I said, that before you choose the firewall, you need to do a testing, performance testing, which is you can emulate, you can look into how much traffic you generate, how much traffic is passing through your current firewall, what do you expect, what the growth is, and then you can calculate what would be your network utilization cost or data users cost along with the firewall cost. Now, scalability. This is where it is, again, is no-brainer here. From the Azure firewall perspective, it auto scales, right? You don't, or we don't even have to worry about it. As soon as it hits the 60% utilization of CPU or more, it would add additional VMs into your VM skill set. It may take about 5 to 6 minutes to get a new additional VMs there, and there's no firewall reboot. On the other hand, when you go into the Palo Alto side, you can only scale up the SKUs, right? Generally in the active passive configuration or active configuration, and it will require a reboot. Now, another important point that I want to touch here is the number of the session limits, right? This is not a Palo limitation. This is a Microsoft Azure VM limitation. So if you look into when you're using a VM, a normal VM, it can handle up to 500K active connections in both directions, right? Now, in the Azure Firewall's perspective, you know that you're using a scale set. You are aware of there are at least more than 3 VMs there. I'm not sure how many VMs are introduced by Microsoft when you initially deploy it, but they are definitely more than 3, right? So the number of sessions that you have here on Azure Firewall is definitely way higher than when you go into the other side, right? If you look into this side, when a Palo Alto, according to Microsoft, VMs with the network virtual appliances and VAs such as gateway, proxy, firewall can only handle 250K active connections and 500K active flows in each direction. Now, that's a difference here, right? And especially now consider if you're running into active passive mode, you have a single VM. Now your threshold of total number of sessions is only 250K. So if your workload, depending on the organization, how large, how big, how much traffic you expect, like you may be an e-commerce site and you may be getting, and I know it because I have ran into this issue, then you are going to be hitting this threshold very soon, very fast, and then you would have issues, right? If the firewall starts failing over in an active passive configuration, then what happens is that it takes about 5 minutes, generally up to 5 minutes to fail over, and it causes outages. Basically, it will cause a business disruption. It will lose the sessions, right? The already existing session. That's a pain, right? Now, these are the things that I learned out of my personal experience, and I'm sharing with you. You may not find this data reported in generally all these other blogs, because this is important, right? If you expect a large number of active sessions, active connections, then you definitely want to double check it, that how you're going to architect your firewall solution. It just does not apply to Palo Alto. It applies to any NVA when we talk about the session limit, right? So I think I have explained to you enough, and you need to look into whether this is good or this is bad for you and make the appropriate decision. Moving forward, when we say the Palo Alto scenario, when you do source netting, right? Especially when you are deploying an active passive when you deploy Palo Alto in active mode, we need to do the source netting in most scenario for any DNet traffic. So for an example, if you're coming from internet or public and you need to do the destination network address translation in active configuration, you would need to do the source netting on Palo. That means the source IP address would be changed from the origin IP address to the Azure Firewall untrusted interface IP address, right? That is what I have observed. This is what is true. And it may not be an issue for many organizations, but if you have applications in the background that needs to look into the origin IP address in the packet, then that could become a challenge, right? That would be a challenge. I have ran into this scenario, so that's what I'm sharing with you. And active passive is okay, but in active passive, you're limiting the number of VMs available to you only a single VM. So would that work for you or not? Would that be a challenge for you or not? I can't tell you, but you need to definitely think about it. That and not only from the, as I said in the beginning, not only from the current deployment perspective, also from the future deployment, future growth, future applications perspective too, right? Now, high availability, again, a very important consideration when you deploy these important infrastructure component like firewalls. And as we have discussed earlier, you have a built-in high availability with Azure firewalls, right? You don't have to do anything. You can also use Azure zones with the skill set. So that means you are now your firewalls are available in multiple Azure data center without anything, without paying extra price, without doing any extra effort. That's not the same when you look into the Palo Alto side. You have to design and architect it manually. And you most likely, in my experience, you cannot leverage the Azure zones. And if I'm wrong, please correct me. I have not seen that we can use the Azure zones with the Palo Alto. So definitely a plus for Azure Firewall. Now, this is the piece where the feature wise, and as I mentioned, Palo Alto feature wise, there's no comparison, right? Absolutely, it is very robust. It is feature packed. There is a lot of features, and especially if we are dealing with the PCI industry or card industry, built-in modules, built-in application. This is Palo Alto is way more advanced when we talk about features. Azure is trying to catch it up, but it provides you most of the common feature that most of the organization need. Now, if your needs are different, if you are really futuristic and you need to do some advanced stuff with your firewall, then of course Palo Alto is a clear-cut winner. But if you're doing the regular, IDS, IPS, regular, threat intelligence, regular DNet, regular network routing, east-west, northwest, east-west, north-south traffic, and you are good, then you are pretty much good with the Azure firewall. The only other thing that I think I forgot to mention here, as far as the monitoring is concerned, the real-time monitoring is concerned, I feel Palo Alto is way ahead. Microsoft has to do a lot of work to get to that level of monitoring, right? Basically, they have a new structured firewall logs. It gives you good information. We have policy analytics. We have a single click upgrade and downgrade. They are in the preview mode right now. But this is the area I think where Palo Alto is way more, ahead. Because often when I need to troubleshoot anything in Palo, I can see whether traffic is coming, where it is going, where it's being denied, and I can troubleshoot it very quickly and very easily. I don't see that interface or that availability very quickly and in a very user-friendly way on Azure Firewall. That is definitely a missing component in my viewpoint, which I have leveraged it multiple times, because often you will have to troubleshoot, especially in a complex networks. You don't know what's happening, right? Whether it's the allow list, whether it's the destination, whether it's a protocol, whether it's a certificate, what is causing that issue that your connection is denied or connection is incomplete. That is way better in Palo than what you would do in Azure Firewall. For simplistic thing, yes, you will know. But the other, if you look at it from the other perspective, Azure Firewall is simple, right? There's no one trust and management interface as per default. You can have the managed interface if you like, but generally you don't have many interfaces to worry about it, right? So, and you can have a multiple public IPs, as I said, but you don't have to deal with going from untrust to the trust interface that you see in Palo Alto. That's not the case with Palo. So it's pretty straightforward. So maybe that compensate to certain extent the missing component from monitoring, but that is a point that I definitely want to mention here. Moving forward, guys, our firewall concepts are basically what we would be dealing in our lab, and I think I just mentioned here a few things, but we'll be going in more details once we get into um, our demo, right? A demo would explain you what firewall policies are, why do we use route tables, how do you use firewall manager. I think that's what is the first part of this presentation, and I will stop it here, and then we can now dive into the second part of this video, which would be the actual demonstration of um, Azure Firewall. Thank you all. Hopefully I'll see you into the second video. Thanks for watching. I hope it helps, and please provide your valuable comments wherever. I learned from your experiences as well. So if I made any mistake, please correct me. Thank you again. Have a great day or great evening, whichever part of the world you are.